November 30th, 1942. 2,000 yards off Tassafaronga Point, Guadalcanal. Commander William Cole watched his radar scope aboard the heavy cruiser USS New Orleans as 8 Japanese destroyers materialized from the darkness. American forces held every advantage: 4 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 6 destroyers, and the technological marvel called radar that let them see the enemy first. The Japanese force consisted solely of destroyers on a supply run, lightly armed with cargo instead of ammunition. At 11:16 p.m., American cruisers opened fire with devastating accuracy. 1 Japanese destroyer exploded almost immediately, lighting the tropical night. Victory seemed certain, but in those opening moments, while American guns thundered and shells tore into Japanese ships, something else was happening in the darkness. Something the Americans couldn't see, couldn't track, couldn't stop. Japanese destroyers were doing what they'd trained to do for 2 decades, launching torpedoes before turning away. 19 torpedoes sliced through black water at 48 knots, trailing almost no wake, carrying 1,100-pound warheads, racing toward targets 11,000 yards away. The Americans, focused on their gunnery success, never saw them coming. Within 6 minutes, 4 American heavy cruisers were torn open below the waterline. Minneapolis lost her entire bow. The New Orleans saw her bow ripped completely off at turret 2. The Pensacola burned from a massive hole in her port side. The Northampton would sink before dawn. One American victory had transformed into catastrophic defeat because the men who held technological superiority didn't understand the nature of the weapons they faced or the tactics their enemy employed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Standing in the operations room of the USS Fletcher, 2 months later, Commander Ernest Evans stared at after-action reports that revealed a pattern American naval commanders no longer had the luxury of ignoring. In 8 major surface engagements since August 1942, Japanese destroyers and cruisers had sunk or crippled 15 Allied warships using torpedo attacks that seemingly defied the laws of naval combat. The mathematics were brutal. Japanese torpedoes hit targets from ranges exceeding 20,000 yards. American Mark 15 torpedoes became unreliable beyond 6,000 yards. Japanese warheads carried 1,100 pounds of explosive. American warheads held 825 pounds. Japanese oxygen-powered torpedoes left almost no visible wake. American torpedoes announced their approach with bubble trails any lookout could spot in moonlight, but the numbers told only part of the story. The tactical doctrine told the rest. American destroyer captains had been taught since the 1930s that their primary weapon was guns. Fleet Tactical Publication 143 explicitly stated that destroyers should attack with guns first and reserve torpedoes for capital ships. The reasoning seemed sound. American 5-inch 38 caliber guns could fire 15 rounds per minute with radar-directed accuracy. Why waste torpedoes on enemy destroyers when gunfire could accomplish the same result? The doctrine assumed a particular reality. It assumed enemy torpedoes had limitations similar to American weapons. It assumed that technological advantages like radar would dominate nighttime engagements. It assumed that superior firepower would overwhelm inferior numbers. Every one of these assumptions had been destroyed in the waters off Guadalcanal. Commander Evans knew the specifics because he'd studied them obsessively. At Savo Island, on August 9, 1942, Japanese cruisers and destroyers had approached an Allied force that included American and Australian cruisers, with surface search radar. The radar gave early warning. The Allied force had superior numbers and firepower. None of it mattered. Japanese forces launched torpedoes before American ships could effectively respond. 4 Allied heavy cruisers went to the bottom. 1 Australian cruiser barely escaped. Over 1,000 Allied sailors died. The Japanese force lost nothing. The battle revealed something that pre-war planning had never adequately considered. Surface search radar could detect enemy ships at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards, but detection alone didn't translate into tactical advantage. American doctrine emphasized immediate gunfire because American torpedoes needed close range to be effective. Japanese doctrine emphasized torpedo attacks first, because Japanese torpedoes could reach targets at distances where American weapons were useless. American captains saw targets on radar and opened fire. Japanese captains saw gun flashes in darkness and launched torpedoes at the revealed positions. The longer range of Japanese torpedoes meant they'd hit their targets before American torpedoes could even reach effective range. American destroyers that immediately opened fire with guns were painting targets on themselves for weapons they couldn't see coming from distances they didn't believe possible. November 30th at Tassafaronga had demonstrated the pattern with mathematical precision. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka commanded 8 destroyers carrying supplies for isolated Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. His ships were loaded with drums of food and ammunition lashed to their decks, reducing their combat effectiveness. American forces under Rear Admiral Carleton Wright outnumbered them with overwhelming firepower. Wright's formation included 4 heavy cruisers, mounting 8-inch guns, 1 light cruiser, and 6 destroyers. His flagship, USS Minneapolis, carried SG radar that had detected Japanese forces at 23,000 yards. Wright had every advantage, except understanding. The battle began when American cruisers opened fire at 7,000 yards. The Japanese destroyer Takanami, leading the formation, absorbed the concentrated fire of multiple cruisers. She was hit repeatedly. Fire consumed her superstructure. She would sink within minutes. American gunners were delivering precisely the kind of devastating firepower that pre-war doctrine had promised would dominate surface engagements. But while American guns fired and American crews focused on their gunnery success, Japanese destroyers did something that American tactical training had never adequately prepared for. They launched torpedoes immediately, not after assessing the situation, not after maneuvering for optimal firing position. Immediately, Type 93 torpedoes, called long lances by Americans who survived encountering them, began their runs at 11:21 p.m. They traveled at 48 knots, faster than most destroyers could manage. Their oxygen propulsion left minimal wake, making visual detection nearly impossible at night. Their 1,100-pound warheads could tear open cruiser hulls below the waterline, where armor was weakest and flooding most catastrophic. They had a maximum range of 43,000 yards at 36 knots, or 22,000 yards at 48 knots. These weren't theoretical specifications. These were capabilities Japanese destroyers demonstrated repeatedly in combat. The American formation continued firing. Radar-directed gunfire was hitting Japanese ships. The tactical situation appeared to favor the Americans. Then, at 11:27 p.m., 6 minutes after Japanese destroyers launched torpedoes, the Minneapolis took a massive hit below the waterline forward. The explosion tore away her bow completely, leaving her forward turrets hanging over the open ocean. 30 seconds later, the New Orleans took a hit that detonated in her forward aviation fuel tanks. The explosion sheared off her bow at turret 2 and ignited fires that consumed everything forward. 1 minute after that, the Pensacola took a torpedo that ripped through her port side and detonated in her engine spaces. The Northampton absorbed 2 hits that opened her hull to catastrophic flooding. She would capsize and sink at 3 a.m. 4 heavy cruisers had been hit by weapons launched before American guns had even begun firing effectively. The Japanese had lost 1 destroyer. The Americans had lost 1 cruiser and had 3 others crippled so severely they required months of repair. This wasn't an ambush. This wasn't a surprise encounter in darkness. This was a meeting engagement where American forces had radar detection, superior firepower, overwhelming numbers, and perfect tactical awareness of enemy positions. And they'd still lost because they didn't understand the weapons or the tactics they faced. Commander Evans and other destroyer officers studied these reports with growing realization that something fundamental needed to change. American destroyers had all the tools necessary for nighttime dominance. SG surface search radar could detect enemy ships at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards. Fire control radar could direct guns with accuracy that pre-war gunners would have considered impossible. Communication systems allowed coordinated attacks. The Mark 15 torpedo, for all its limitations compared to Japanese weapons, could still sink enemy destroyers if properly employed. But doctrine dictated that destroyers open fire immediately and reserve torpedoes for capital ship targets. That doctrine was killing American sailors. The logic behind the doctrine had made sense in the 1930s. Fleet problem exercises had suggested that destroyer torpedo attacks in darkness resulted in confusion, friendly fire, and limited effectiveness. Gunnery seemed more reliable. American 5-inch guns had superior fire control systems. The solution appeared obvious: use the superior weapon. But the fleet problems had been conducted before the development of effective surface search radar. They'd assumed American torpedoes would be competitive with Japanese weapons. They'd optimized for scenarios where American destroyers would be supporting battle line formations rather than fighting independent actions against enemy light forces. By January 1943, the casualties had mounted to levels that demanded response. 8 major night surface actions had resulted in devastating losses. American forces had sunk Japanese ships, but the cost had been disproportionate. Japanese torpedo attacks had sunk or crippled ships that American doctrine insisted should have been invulnerable to destroyer-launched weapons. The pattern was consistent enough that it couldn't be dismissed as bad luck or Japanese skill. This was a doctrinal problem. American tactics were optimized for a battle that wasn't happening. Japanese tactics were optimized for the actual combat conditions in the Solomon Islands, and Japanese tactics were winning. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, sent a dispatch that would change American destroyer tactics for the remainder of the war. SINCPAC dispatch dated February 15, 1943, addressed lessons learned from surface actions in the Solomons campaign. The language was direct. American forces were failing to exploit their technological advantages. Radar detection meant nothing if tactical doctrine negated its benefits. Superior firepower was irrelevant if enemy torpedoes hit first. The dispatch outlined specific changes. Destroyers would emphasize torpedo attacks over gunnery in night engagements with enemy light forces. Radar would be used for positioning and surprise, rather than merely for detection. Formations would be adjusted to allow rapid torpedo deployment, without restricting movement. Most importantly, commanders would understand that the enemy possessed torpedoes with capabilities, far exceeding American weapons. Fighting effectively meant acknowledging that reality and adapting tactics accordingly. The changes met resistance. Destroyer captains who'd spent careers training in gunnery tactics were being told that torpedoes, the weapon most had rarely employed in combat, should become their primary offensive tool in night engagements. Gunfire control systems represented the cutting edge of naval technology. The Mark 37 director, combined with the Mark 12 radar, could lay guns on targets with precision that made old-fashioned visual ranging seem primitive. Abandoning immediate gunfire felt like squandering technological advantage, but the casualty lists provided an overwhelming argument. When American destroyers opened fire first, they revealed their positions to enemy forces armed with superior torpedoes. The gun flashes that made visual aiming possible for American gunners also provided aiming points for Japanese torpedo officers, calculating firing solutions from distances where American torpedoes couldn't reach. Captain Arleigh Burke, commanding Destroyer Squadron 23, studied the new tactical guidance with the intensity that characterized his approach to naval warfare. Burke had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1923. He served on destroyers through the 1930s. He'd participated in fleet problem exercises. He understood the doctrine that emphasized gunnery because he'd helped develop and teach it. But Burke also understood that doctrine based on outdated assumptions was worse than useless. It was deadly. The Japanese long-lance torpedo represented a weapon class that American pre-war planning had never adequately considered. Fleet exercises had assumed that enemy torpedoes would have similar characteristics to American weapons. That assumption had been spectacularly wrong. The Type 93 torpedo that Japanese cruisers and destroyers carried was oxygen-powered. Compressed oxygen replaced the compressed air that powered American torpedoes. The difference in oxidizer transformed the weapon. Compressed air was 21% oxygen and 78% nitrogen. The nitrogen provided no propulsive power and created extensive bubble trails that marked torpedo paths in water. Pure oxygen provided nearly 5 times the oxidizer in the same tank volume. Exhaust consisted primarily of carbon dioxide and water vapor, both highly soluble in seawater, leaving minimal wake. The result was a torpedo that traveled faster, farther, and more covertly than anything American naval forces had encountered. Japanese torpedo development had begun in the 1920s as a direct response to Washington naval treaty limitations. Japan had been assigned an unfavorable 5-5-3 ratio in capital ship tonnage compared to the United States and Britain. Japanese naval planners understood that any Pacific war would likely involve a decisive fleet engagement where American numerical superiority would prove overwhelming unless Japan could reduce American strength before battle. Torpedo tactics and night combat became the chosen method for whittling down American forces. But executing such tactics required torpedoes capable of hitting targets from ranges where Japanese light forces could attack without being destroyed by American gunfire. Development focused on creating a weapon that could threaten battleships from distances where American destroyer screens couldn't effectively respond. The engineering challenges were substantial. Pure oxygen was inherently dangerous. Premature detonation during launch could destroy the firing ship. Storage and handling required procedures that prevented accidental ignition. Japanese engineers developed solutions through meticulous testing against actual target ships. They perfected warhead detonators that were both rugged and reliable. They created handling procedures that minimized risk while maximizing combat effectiveness. The resulting weapon exceeded all design expectations. By 1941, Japanese destroyers and cruisers carried torpedoes that could reach 43,000 yards at 36 knots. They could travel 22,000 yards at 48 knots. They carried 1,100-pound warheads designed to break battleship keels. They left almost no visible wake at night, and American intelligence had almost no accurate information about their true capabilities. Pre-war intelligence reports had mentioned Japanese oxygen torpedoes, but the reports estimated range at 20,000 yards maximum. American planners assumed this represented optimal performance under perfect conditions. Combat experience in the Solomons revealed that 20,000 yards was actually conservative. Japanese torpedoes regularly hit targets at ranges American doctrine considered impossible. The intelligence failure compounded the tactical disaster. American commanders made decisions based on threat assessments that were catastrophically wrong. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger commanded Destroyer Division 12, 6 Fletcher-class destroyers that represented the newest and most capable destroyers in American service. Fletcher-class ships displaced 2,500 tons fully loaded. They mounted 5 5-inch 38 caliber guns in single turrets. They carried 10 torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple mounts. Their SG surface search radar could detect large ships at 25,000 yards. Their Mark 37 fire control directors, combined with Mark 12 radar, could lay guns on targets with accuracy that made visual ranging obsolete. These ships had every technical capability necessary for night surface combat. They just needed doctrine that exploited those capabilities effectively. Moosbrugger studied after-action reports from Tassafaronga with particular attention to timeline. Japanese destroyers had launched torpedoes within minutes of detecting American forces. They hadn't waited to optimize firing position. They hadn't maneuvered for ideal range. They'd fired immediately at maximum effective range and then turned away at high speed. The tactic accepted lower hit probability in exchange for launching before American guns could achieve decisive results. Against American forces that opened fire first and reserved torpedoes for later, the tactic worked perfectly. Japanese torpedoes would hit before American torpedoes were even launched. The solution appeared obvious once the problem was properly understood. American destroyers needed to launch torpedoes first, before opening fire with guns. Radar would provide detection at ranges where enemy ships couldn't see American forces. That detection advantage could be used to position for torpedo attacks rather than immediate gunfire. American destroyers would close to effective torpedo range, launch full spreads, and only then open fire with guns. The enemy would face incoming torpedoes before knowing American destroyers were present. Even if the enemy launched their own torpedoes, American warships would already be maneuvering away, reducing their vulnerability. The tactic inverted American doctrine, but it matched the actual combat environment. Japanese forces had superior torpedoes with longer range. That advantage was fixed. American forces couldn't change Japanese weapons, but American forces had radar that could detect enemy ships before visual contact. That advantage wasn't being exploited. Using radar for gunfire control was useful. Using radar for positioning surprise torpedo attacks was decisive. The shift in emphasis didn't require abandoning gunnery. It required understanding that in night surface combat against enemy light forces armed with long-lance torpedoes, the side that launched torpedoes first would likely win regardless of what happened afterward. Burke and Moosbrugger began drilling their destroyer divisions in the new tactics. The fundamental principle was simple: detect early, close silently, launch torpedoes, retire at high speed, then re-engage with guns from positions where enemy torpedo response would be less effective. Execution was complex. Multiple destroyers needed to maneuver in darkness while maintaining formation integrity. Radar contacts needed to be properly identified to prevent friendly fire. Torpedo firing solutions needed to be calculated rapidly from ranges where peacetime training had rarely been practiced. Communications needed to be minimal to avoid alerting enemy forces. The entire engagement sequence needed to be completed in minutes because once torpedoes were in the water, enemy forces would react. Training began in waters off the New Hebrides in July 1943. Destroyer divisions practiced night approach tactics. Radar operators trained to distinguish multiple contacts and track their movements. Fire control parties calculated torpedo firing solutions from various ranges and angles. Communications procedures were refined to allow coordinated attacks without extensive radio transmissions. Commanding officers held conferences before each training exercise to ensure complete understanding of tactical plans. The preparation was exhaustive because the first real test would likely determine whether American destroyers could overcome Japanese night combat superiority or would continue suffering catastrophic losses. The doctrinal shift represented more than tactical adjustment. It acknowledged that American pre-war assumptions about night surface combat had been fundamentally wrong. Japanese forces had trained for night torpedo attacks for 2 decades. They'd developed weapons and tactics specifically optimized for those attacks. They'd refined their approach through realistic training that American forces had avoided after a 1923 disaster when 7 destroyers ran aground at Point Honda during high-speed night maneuvers. American naval leadership had concluded that realistic night training was too dangerous. Japanese naval leadership had concluded that realistic night training was essential. By 1943, the results of those different conclusions were clear in the casualty lists. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. August 6, 1943. Commander Moosbrugger's Destroyer Division 12 received orders to intercept a Japanese resupply mission heading toward Kolombangara in the Solomon Islands. Intelligence indicated 4 destroyers carrying troops and supplies. The mission, known as the Tokyo Express or Rat Run, was typical of Japanese attempts to reinforce isolated garrisons under cover of darkness. Previous American attempts to intercept these runs had resulted in mixed outcomes. Sometimes American forces sank Japanese ships. Sometimes Japanese forces sank American ships. The battles were confused night actions, where technological advantages and numerical superiority often failed to produce decisive results. This time would be different. Moosbrugger held a conference with all commanding officers before departure from Tulagi. The battle plan was discussed. Information was exchanged. Every possible situation was analyzed. The conference ensured complete mutual understanding of tactics and communications. This preparation was crucial because the battle would be fought at night, at high speed, with minimal radio communication. Once action began, individual commanding officers would need to know exactly what was expected without extensive orders. The planning was more detailed than previous engagements had required because the tactics were different. Instead of rushing toward enemy contacts and opening fire, American destroyers would use radar to position for a surprise torpedo attack. They would withhold gunfire until torpedoes were launched. They would exploit their context detection advantage rather than squandering it on immediate gunnery. The tactical formation divided Moosbrugger's 6 destroyers into 2 divisions of 3 ships each. The leading division would make the torpedo attack. The trailing division would provide support and engage targets after the initial attack. This formation allowed concentration of force while providing flexibility for maneuvering. It also ensured that if the leading division's attack was detected, enemy forces would face additional threats from unexpected directions. The plan was specific about engagement sequence. Detect enemy forces with radar at maximum range, close to optimal torpedo firing range while remaining undetected. Launch full torpedo spreads from both leading destroyers, retire at high speed, then re-engage with gunfire. The sequence prioritized the most effective weapon first, rather than the most familiar weapon first. At 11:38 p.m., radar aboard USS Dunlap detected 4 contacts at 21,000 yards. Range closed rapidly as both forces steamed toward each other. The Japanese formation was proceeding in column, one ship following another, at approximately 25 knots. They showed no indication of detecting American forces. SG radar tracked their movements with precision while American destroyers remained dark and silent. At 8,000 yards, Moosbrugger ordered both leading divisions to prepare for torpedo attack. Firing range was selected at 4,000 yards, close enough for high hit probability, far enough to allow retirement before enemy guns could achieve effective fire. At 4,000 yards, American destroyers turned to unmask their torpedo tubes. 24 Mark 15 torpedoes entered the water within 90 seconds. Full spreads from multiple ships created overlapping fields of fire that covered potential evasion routes. The Japanese formation had seconds to react to weapons they couldn't see coming from ships they didn't know were present. The torpedoes ran true. 3 Japanese destroyers took multiple hits within 4 minutes. The Arashi, Hajikaze, and Kawakaze all suffered catastrophic damage. Only the Shigure, trailing the formation, avoided the initial attack by radical maneuvering. But by then, American destroyers had completed their retirement and were repositioning for gun action. The battle that followed was brief and one-sided. Japanese forces were disorganized, damaged, and outnumbered. American gunfire completed the destruction of ships already crippled by torpedoes. The Battle of Vella Gulf ended at 12:17 a.m., 39 minutes after first radar contact. American forces had sunk 3 Japanese destroyers and routed the 4th. No American ships were damaged. No American sailors were killed. The victory was so complete it seemed impossible compared to previous night engagements. But the difference wasn't luck or Japanese incompetence. The difference was tactical doctrine. American destroyers had exploited their radar advantage to position for surprise torpedo attacks. They'd launched their most effective weapons first, instead of announcing their presence with gunfire. They'd fought the battle according to actual combat realities rather than pre-war assumptions about destroyer tactics. The result was the first clear American victory in a night surface action since the Guadalcanal campaign began 13 months earlier. The implications extended beyond one tactical victory. American destroyer forces could dominate night combat if they used appropriate doctrine. Radar provided detection advantages that became decisive when properly exploited. Japanese torpedo superiority mattered less when American forces launched first from positions where enemy forces couldn't respond. The psychological impact was equally significant. American destroyer crews had spent a year watching Japanese forces win night battles, despite American advantages in numbers, firepower, and technology. Vella Gulf demonstrated that American forces could win decisively when doctrine matched combat realities. Captain Burke's Destroyer Squadron 23 would implement these lessons with devastating effectiveness over the following months. Burke developed tactics that emphasized aggressive use of radar for positioning, coordinated torpedo attacks, and rapid maneuvering to avoid enemy counterattack. His squadron became known as the Little Beavers, and their combat record would establish them as the most successful destroyer squadron in the Pacific theater. But the success began with understanding that technological advantage meant nothing without tactical doctrine to exploit it. The transformation in American destroyer tactics was most dramatically demonstrated at the Battle of Cape St. George on November 25, 1943. Burke's Little Beavers intercepted 5 Japanese destroyers on another Tokyo Express run. Using radar detection and coordinated maneuvers, Burke's destroyers achieved complete tactical surprise. They sank 3 Japanese destroyers without suffering any damage. The Japanese forces, executing the same torpedo tactics that had devastated American cruisers at Tassafaronga exactly 1 year earlier, found themselves facing enemies who'd learned to fight on different terms. The battle began when radar aboard USS Charles Osborne detected Japanese forces at 22,000 yards. Burke ordered his division to close while maintaining radar contact. At 14,000 yards, he split his formation to attack from multiple angles. At 4,000 yards, American destroyers launched torpedoes while remaining undetected. Japanese forces realized they were under attack only when torpedoes hit the Onami, breaking her back and sending her to the bottom within minutes. The remaining Japanese destroyers turned away at high speed and launched their own torpedoes, but they were firing at radar contacts from extreme range, while American fighting destroyers were already maneuvering evasively. None of the Japanese torpedoes found targets. American destroyers pursued the fleeing Japanese force and sank 2 more destroyers with gunfire and additional torpedo attacks. The battle lasted less than an hour. 3 Japanese destroyers were sunk, 2 escaped heavily damaged. American forces suffered no hits and minimal casualties. The tactical evolution was complete. American destroyers had transformed from victims of Japanese torpedo doctrine to masters of radar-directed surprise attacks. The change required abandoning pre-war assumptions about destroyer tactics. It required acknowledging that enemy weapons had capabilities American planning had never adequately considered. It required accepting that technological advantages like radar became decisive only when tactical doctrine exploited them properly. Most fundamentally, it required understanding that in night surface combat against enemies armed with superior torpedoes, the force that launched first would likely win. The statistical transformation was dramatic. In the 8 major night surface actions from August 1942 through July 1943, American forces had lost or had severely damaged 15 major warships, including 4 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 8 destroyers. Japanese forces had lost or had severely damaged 11 ships. The exchange ratio favored Japanese forces despite American advantages in numbers, firepower, and radar technology. In the 4 major night surface actions from August 1943 through November 1943, after implementation of revised destroyer tactics, American forces sank 12 Japanese warships without losing a single ship. The reversal was so complete, it effectively ended Japanese attempts to use destroyers for supply runs in the Central Solomons. The transformation extended beyond the Solomons. By mid-1944, American destroyer forces throughout the Pacific were implementing tactics that prioritized torpedo attacks over immediate gunfire in night engagements. Training programs incorporated lessons from Vela Gulf and Cape Street George. New construction destroyers entered service with crews already trained in radar-directed surprise attack tactics. The institutional knowledge that had cost so many lives to acquire was being transmitted to new ships and new commanders before they entered combat. The learning curve that had been so steep and so costly in 1942 and 1943 was being flattened through systematic training and doctrinal refinement. October 24, 1944, Surigao Strait. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf commanded 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 28 destroyers positioned to block the southern entrance to Leyte Gulf. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura led a Japanese force of 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers attempting to force the strait. The tactical situation favored Oldendorf overwhelmingly. His forces outnumbered Japanese ships 3-1. His battleships mounted main batteries that outranged anything Japanese forces could bring to bear. His cruisers and destroyers all had radar, but the battle would be fought at night in confined waters, conditions where Japanese forces had historically excelled. The outcome would demonstrate how completely American destroyer tactics had evolved. American destroyers executed coordinated torpedo attacks beginning at 2:58 a.m. The attacks came in waves from multiple directions. Japanese forces found themselves maneuvering to avoid torpedoes from one direction, only to expose themselves to attacks from another. Radar-directed fire control allowed American destroyers to launch from optimal range and then retire before Japanese guns could achieve effective fire. The battleship Fuso took multiple torpedo hits that broke her in half. The battleship Yamashiro absorbed several hits that reduced her speed and damaged her fire control systems. 3 Japanese destroyers were sunk. The cruiser Mogami was crippled. By the time Nishimura's surviving ships came within range of Oldendorf's battle line, they were already severely damaged and disorganized. The battleships delivered the final blows, but destroyer torpedo attacks had decided the outcome. The battle represented the final vindication of American destroyer tactics. Japanese forces, fighting in the tactical environment they'd historically dominated, were overwhelmed by enemies who'd learned to exploit every advantage. Radar provided detection and fire control that made night no cover for attacking forces. Revised doctrine ensured that American advantages weren't squandered on premature gunfire. Coordinated attacks from multiple divisions created overlapping torpedo spreads that left minimal room for evasion. The Japanese advantage in torpedo range mattered less when American destroyers used radar to position for attacks at ranges where Japanese forces couldn't respond effectively. The transformation from Tassafaronga to Surigao Strait had taken less than 2 years. In that period, American destroyer forces had evolved from victims of Japanese torpedo doctrine to masters of night surface combat. The change hadn't required new technology. Fletcher-class destroyers at Surigao possessed the same basic capabilities as the destroyers at Tassafaronga. SG radar was fundamentally the same equipment. Mark 15 torpedoes hadn't improved substantially. What had changed was doctrine. American forces had learned to fight according to actual combat conditions, rather than pre-war assumptions. They'd learned that technological advantages mattered only when tactical doctrine exploited them properly. They'd learned, at brutal cost, that doctrine based on obsolete assumptions killed sailors, regardless of how superior their equipment might be. The lessons extended beyond destroyer tactics into fundamental questions about military innovation and adaptation. American forces in 1942 had possessed all the tools necessary for night combat superiority. Radar was a revolutionary technology that promised decisive advantages in darkness and poor visibility. Superior numbers and firepower should have overwhelmed inferior Japanese forces. Industrial capacity ensured that losses could be replaced faster than Japan could inflict them. But none of these advantages mattered because tactical doctrine negated them. Radar that detected enemy forces at 20,000 yards was useless if doctrine called for opening fire immediately, revealing American positions to enemies armed with superior torpedoes. Superior firepower was irrelevant if enemy torpedoes hit first. Industrial capacity couldn't replace the trained sailors dying in ships that sank because doctrine hadn't adapted to actual combat realities. The price of institutional learning had been measured in sunken ships and dead sailors. Over 1,000 Americans died at Savo Island. Over 400 died at Tassafaronga. Hundreds more died in the night engagements that followed. Each battle produced after-action reports. Each report identified problems with existing doctrine. But changing doctrine required overcoming institutional resistance from officers who'd built careers on particular assumptions about naval warfare. It required acknowledging that pre-war planning had been fundamentally wrong about major aspects of surface combat. It required accepting that an enemy force, numerically inferior and technologically less advanced in many areas, had developed tactics and weapons that gave them clear superiority in night surface actions. The acknowledgement came slowly and at terrible cost. Number U.S. Destroyer Tactics, Script, Part 2 Final. But when institutional learning finally occurred, the transformation was remarkably swift. From February 1943, when Admiral Nimitz issued his dispatch on revised surface combat doctrine, through August 1943, when Moosbrugger executed the first successful implementation at Vella Gulf, was only 6 months. In that period, destroyer commanders absorbed new tactical concepts, trained their divisions in revised procedures, and executed combat operations that demonstrated complete reversal of previous combat outcomes. The speed of adaptation, once senior leadership committed to change, suggested that the institutional barriers had been more significant than the tactical challenges. The human element of this transformation deserves examination beyond tactical statistics. Destroyer captains in 1942 were commanding officers who'd spent careers training in particular doctrinal frameworks. They'd conducted countless training exercises, emphasizing gunnery as the primary destroyer weapon. They'd been evaluated on their ability to bring guns to bear rapidly and accurately. They'd advanced through ranks by demonstrating excellence in doctrines that Fleet Tactical Publication 143 codified, telling these officers that their primary training, their professional expertise, their path to command, had been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions, was not a simple administrative adjustment. It was asking them to question everything they'd been taught about their profession, yet most adapted rapidly once confronted with evidence that couldn't be dismissed. After action reports from Savo Island, Tassafaronga, and subsequent engagements provided documentation that existing doctrine was failing catastrophically. Destroyer captains could read the reports, study the timelines, analyze the weapon capabilities, and reach their own conclusions about necessary changes. The evidence wasn't ambiguous. American forces with superior numbers, firepower, and radar were losing night engagements to enemies armed with superior torpedoes and appropriate tactics. Professional officers, when presented with clear evidence that doctrine was failing, generally accepted the need for change, even when that change challenged their own training and experience. The exception proved instructive. Some senior officers, particularly those who'd built reputations on traditional destroyer gunnery tactics, resisted revised doctrine. They argued that American technological advantages should be leveraged through immediate gunfire. They suggested that torpedo attacks in darkness would result in confusion and friendly fire. They proposed that better fire control, more intensive training in existing doctrine, would produce improved outcomes. These arguments weren't baseless. There were legitimate risks associated with multiple destroyers maneuvering at night to launch torpedoes. Coordination was challenging. Visual identification of targets was difficult. Radar could track contacts, but couldn't definitively distinguish friend from enemy at ranges where decisions needed to be made. The concerns were valid, but they were outweighed by the fundamental reality that existing doctrine was producing unacceptable casualties. The resolution came through demonstration rather than argument. Vela Gulf and Cape Street. George provided empirical evidence that revised tactics worked. American destroyers achieved decisive victories without suffering losses. Japanese forces, executing the same tactics that had devastated American cruisers a year earlier, were overwhelmed. The battles demonstrated that risks associated with revised doctrine were manageable through proper training and communication. More importantly, they demonstrated that risks of continuing with existing doctrine were unacceptable. After Cape Street George, institutional resistance to revised destroyer tactics effectively disappeared. The evidence was too clear, too recent, too dramatic to be dismissed. By early 1944, the transformation was complete. Every American destroyer division in the Pacific Theater was training and operating under revised tactical doctrine. New destroyers entering service were incorporating radar-directed surprise torpedo attacks into their basic training. Fleet tactical publications were being rewritten to reflect lessons learned in the Solomons. The institutional knowledge that had cost so many lives was being systematically transmitted to every level of destroyer operations, and the results were demonstrable in combat outcomes that consistently favored American forces. The Japanese response to this transformation revealed their own institutional limitations. Japanese destroyer forces continued using tactics that had proven successful in 1942 and early 1943. They maintained emphasis on immediate torpedo attacks. They continued to rely on superior torpedo range and nighttime conditions to negate American advantages in numbers and firepower. But they failed to adapt to American radar capabilities. Japanese destroyers in late 1943 were fighting essentially the same way they'd fought in early 1942. The tactics that had produced victories at Savo Island and Tassafaronga continued to be employed even after they stopped working. This failure of adaptation reflected broader problems in Japanese naval doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Navy had developed excellent torpedoes and tactics for their employment through extensive pre-war training and development, but they'd never developed effective radar. Japanese destroyers in 1944 still lacked the surface search radar that American destroyers had possessed since 1942. This meant Japanese forces couldn't detect American destroyers at ranges where American forces could detect them. The detection advantage that American forces had possessed but failed to exploit in early engagements had become, by late 1943, a decisive advantage because American doctrine now exploited it properly. Japanese forces also lacked the institutional flexibility to adapt rapidly to changing tactical situations. American forces, after suffering catastrophic losses, had revised doctrine within months. Japanese forces, after suffering catastrophic losses to revised American doctrine, continued employing tactics that no longer worked. The difference reflected different organizational cultures. American naval organization emphasized decentralized decision-making and adaptation based on combat experience. Japanese naval organization emphasized centralized control and adherence to established doctrine. When circumstances changed, American forces adapted more rapidly because individual commanders had more authority to implement new approaches. Japanese forces adapted more slowly because changes required approval from higher authority that might not understand battlefield realities. The material consequences of this tactical evolution extended throughout the Pacific Campaign. By mid-1944, American destroyer forces dominated night surface combat so completely that Japanese naval forces largely abandoned attempts to contest American nighttime operations. The Tokyo Express runs that had successfully resupplied isolated garrisons in the Solomons became impossible, as American destroyers intercepted and destroyed Japanese supply missions. Japanese forces attempting nighttime reinforcement or evacuation operations faced nearly certain interception by radar-equipped American destroyers executing surprise torpedo attacks. The sea lines of communication that Japanese strategy depended on were increasingly cut by American forces that had learned to fight effectively in darkness. The broader strategic implications were substantial. Japanese naval strategy had relied on using light forces, particularly destroyers and cruisers, to whittle down American strength through nighttime attacks before risking major fleet actions. The strategy assumed Japanese superiority in night combat through superior torpedoes, superior training, and superior tactics. By mid-1944, all three assumptions were invalid. American forces had learned to neutralize Japanese torpedo advantages through radar-directed surprise attacks. American training had caught up to and exceeded Japanese training through intensive combat experience and systematic incorporation of lessons learned. American tactics, once based on flawed assumptions, now properly exploited technological and numerical advantages. The transformation affected more than destroyer tactics. The lessons learned about institutional adaptation, technological exploitation, and doctrinal flexibility influenced American naval operations throughout the remaining war years. The recognition that technological advantage meant nothing without appropriate doctrine to exploit it became embedded in American military thinking. The understanding that doctrine based on outdated assumptions could negate material superiority influenced post-war military education. The acknowledgement that enemies might develop capabilities that exceeded American planning assumptions led to more realistic threat assessment in subsequent conflicts. Individual commanders who implemented revised destroyer tactics would shape American naval leadership for decades. Arleigh Burke, whose Little Beavers demonstrated the effectiveness of radar-directed surprise attacks, would become Chief of Naval Operations and serve longer in that position than anyone before or since. Frederick Moosbrugger, who executed the first successful implementation at Vela Gulf, would command amphibious forces in major Pacific landings. The destroyer captains who adapted to revised doctrine, who learned to fight according to actual combat realities rather than pre-war assumptions, formed the core of post-war naval leadership. Their experiences influenced how the American Navy approached technological development, tactical doctrine, and institutional learning for the next generation. The destroyers themselves deserve recognition, beyond their tactical employment. Fletcher-class destroyers, which formed the backbone of American destroyer forces from mid-1943 onward, proved remarkably versatile platforms. The ships displaced 2,500 tons, mounted 5 5-inch guns, carried 10 torpedo tubes, and possessed sufficient stability to accommodate substantial modifications as war experience dictated additional capabilities. They could operate as fleet escorts, anti-aircraft pickets, shore bombardment platforms, radar pickets, and independent surface combatants. The same ships that executed surprise torpedo attacks at Vela Gulf provided anti-aircraft defense at Philippine Sea, supported amphibious landings throughout the Pacific, and served as radar pickets during the Okinawa campaign. The versatility reflected good design but also reflected tactical flexibility that allowed one ship class to adapt to multiple missions as strategic circumstances required. The contrast with Japanese destroyer development was significant. Japanese destroyer classes were generally optimized for specific missions. The Fubuki class and subsequent special-type destroyers were designed primarily for torpedo attacks against enemy battle lines. They carried heavy torpedo armament, possessed high speed, and mounted capable gun batteries, but they lacked stability margins for significant modification. As the war progressed and anti-aircraft defense became increasingly critical, Japanese destroyers couldn't accommodate additional weapons without compromising stability. American destroyers, designed with greater stability margins and more flexible weapon systems, adapted to changing requirements more successfully. The difference in design philosophy reflected different approaches to military planning. Japanese designs optimized for specific anticipated scenarios. American designs incorporated flexibility for unanticipated requirements. When circumstances changed, flexibility proved more valuable than optimization. By October 1944 at Surigao Strait, American destroyer forces had achieved complete tactical dominance in night surface combat. The battle demonstrated not just victory but overwhelming superiority. Japanese forces, attempting to force a strait under cover of darkness, were detected at extreme range by radar, subjected to coordinated torpedo attacks from multiple directions, and destroyed before they could effectively engage American battle lines. The outcome wasn't close, it wasn't uncertain, it was inevitable given the tactical evolution American destroyers had undergone. Japanese forces were fighting according to doctrine that had proven successful in 1942. American forces were fighting according to doctrine refined through 2 years of brutal combat experience. The result was never in doubt. The statistical summary of this transformation tells the story in numbers that document dramatic reversal. In the calendar year 1942, American forces lost or had severely damaged 23 major warships in night surface actions. Japanese forces lost or had severely damaged 11 ships. In the calendar year 1943, after implementation of revised destroyer tactics, American forces lost or had severely damaged 6 major warships in night surface actions. Japanese forces lost or had severely damaged 31 ships. In the calendar year 1944, American forces lost 2 ships to Japanese surface action. Japanese forces lost 64 ships to American surface action. The reversal was so complete that by 1945, Japanese surface forces largely avoided nighttime contact with American destroyers. The human cost of institutional learning deserves final acknowledgement. Over 3,000 American sailors died in night surface actions during 1942 and early 1943, while American doctrine failed to exploit technological advantages properly. Each name on casualty lists represented someone who died not from inferior equipment or insufficient courage, but from tactical doctrine that hadn't adapted to combat realities. They died in ships that carried radar capable of detecting enemies at ranges where enemies couldn't detect them. They died while crews executed doctrine that revealed their positions to enemies armed with superior torpedoes. They died because institutional resistance to doctrinal change persisted even after evidence mounted that existing approaches were failing. Their deaths purchased the knowledge that transformed American destroyer tactics and ensured that subsequent generations of destroyer sailors would fight according to doctrines that exploited rather than negated American advantages. The final irony is that American forces in 1942 already possessed all the necessary tools for night combat dominance. SG radar was revolutionary technology that provided detection capabilities Japanese forces would never match. American destroyers were well-armed, well-built ships crewed by capable sailors. Industrial capacity ensured numerical superiority that should have been overwhelming. But none of these advantages mattered because doctrine negated them. The transformation to tactical dominance didn't require new technology. It required new doctrine. It required acknowledging that pre-war assumptions were wrong. It required accepting that enemies possessed capabilities American planning had underestimated. It required institutional learning at catastrophic cost. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.